So one of my favorite lines from Hamilton is when George Washington says, "Winning is easy, young man, governing is harder." And that quote perfectly captures the dilemma facing the new nation after it had won the American Revolutionary War in officially 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. The new founders of the country needed to create some kind of rule book, basically, that would unite 13 very, very, very different and diverse colonies, right? I like this illustration because it shows all of the state flags. And we've talked about just how different, for example, Georgia and South Carolina were from New Hampshire and Rhode Island, for instance. Like, think of this as a diagram showing 13 different countries, right? How do you get 13 different countries to unite together? Well, let's look at some of the problems first facing the newly formed nation. Each state was printing its own money. So if you are a New York merchant trying to buy some goods from Pennsylvania, you have one form of currency here and another form of currency here. That is bound to create some problems. Each state was making its own rules, right? And that's part of federalism, the division of power between the federal government and the state. But like the new rules were completely different from one another. My favorite one is 11 states actually had their own navies. And Virginia's navy was actually larger than the Continental Congress's navy that it outfitted during the American Revolutionary War, right? Like today, states don't have their own armies. There's one army, but back in the day, you had 11 states with their own navies. And each state was levying its own taxes. So goods that were coming from Pennsylvania into New York was taxing them. New York goods into Pennsylvania was taxing them. So there was all kinds of problems, which reflects this central theme, right? After the Revolutionary War, the United States were not very united at all. Referring to the 13 states, they were just all at odds with one another. Because remember, some of these states, like Virginia, it's over 100 years old, right? It dates back to 1607. So if you're from Virginia, like you say you're from Virginia, you don't really say I'm from the United States. You say I'm from Virginia. And these states were not very united because of another central theme. There was this fear of a centralized power, for example, a monarchy, which resulted in the first government of the United States being very weak. The first government of the United States operated under a constitution or a rule book called the Articles of Confederation. In class, I tell my students that anytime, just to keep them on their toes, if I say the Articles of Confederation, they can just shout out, "Didn't work," right? Because they really didn't. Now, they did achieve a couple different things we'll talk about, but the Articles of Confederation were not weak because the whole idea of the Revolutionary War was to avoid a centralized power like a king, like a parliament that disregarded the wishes of its people. There was a terrible fear of a monarchy, and therefore they deliberately made the Articles of Confederation incredibly weak. Each state was operating like its own country, right? All four of these functions are duties that belong to the federal government, not the states. And I think it gives us something to think about because, you can go back in time and it's really remarkable to think that a variety of new nations didn't just emerge from the 13 colonies. Like, how come there wasn't a country here in the New England colonies and here in the middle colonies and one here in the southern colonies, right? I'm really marking this up. But there was a real fear that these 13 colonies would break up and form all kinds of different countries, and that this new continent would look something like Europe, where each state becomes its own country. There were more problems with the articles, which we'll continue to talk about. One of them being that, oh yeah, and remember, the Articles of Confederation is a constitution. And for a constitution, just think of it as a rule book, right? You have to get 13 states to abide by the rules. Therefore, you have a country. So, Articles of Confederation was a constitution. We refer to our constitution as the Constitution, but just think of the Articles as the first constitution of the United States. So, more of the problems that were facing the 13 states under the Articles of Confederation, the voting was not proportional. So a small state like Rhode Island gets 68,000, or a state of Rhode Island, 68,000 people, they get one vote. Virginia is almost 4 times that size, and they get one vote. So states didn't enjoy that. Most of the time, delegates didn't even show up to vote. Half of the time, you'd have only delegates from 11 states there. So they're not really voting on issues. Congress couldn't raise taxes. It could only ask the states for money. Right? Remember the Revolutionary War, like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act? These were acts that was compelling the states to pay money, and the states didn't want to do that. So when they wrote the Articles of Confederation, they deliberately made Congress a body that couldn't raise taxes. But then the problem was Congress had no money, right? Like they would say, "Hey, Pennsylvania, you would give us money." No, we'd rather spend it on ourselves. Or New York, we'd rather spend it on ourselves. It's the same thing today, right? If the IRS just asked me to pay money, I probably wouldn't do it. And in 1783, the Continental Army, actually, all these war veterans, hadn't been paid by Congress because Congress didn't have any money. So they actually chased Congress out of its own capital in Philadelphia, right, in 1783. So there's all kinds of problems occurring in the States. And by the way, there's not really even a name yet, right? They aren't calling it the United States because they're not united. Is it going to be the American Commonwealth or the American Confederation? Yeah. So all of these problems are facing the 13 colonies. There's a political cartoon here that showed up in a British editorial that shows the Americans just begging to come back to Great Britain, sending back the olive branch and saying, "We surrender, we give up. How are we ever going to form our own country?" So the articles showed that there needed to be still yet a stronger government. So the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work, will pave the way for the creation of the U.S. Constitution, a document that is still in effect in use today.